Hello, everybody, and welcome back to Century Farmhouse Kitchen. My name is Anne Marie Craig, and this is my kitchen. Century Farmhouse has been a brand pretty much associated with soap for the last almost 20 years. But a few years ago, I started expanding and doing a few more things that are home arts related. And today I'm going to be sharing with you a recipe and a bake along, if you will, for making some English tea scones. So anyway, I'm in my kitchen. This house has been in my family since 1884, which is about 136 years ago. So my great-grandmother, my grandmother, my mother as she was growing up, all cooked in this kitchen. And here we are again doing it while I'm here, which is wonderful. Okay, so English tea scones. Let me tell you a little bit about the recipe. So this lovely, very dog-eared, stained recipe was shared with me by my sister when she was doing some study in Scotland in the early 1980s. And I took the recipe and adapted it to the American measurement system at the time because I was not working with pounds, ounces, grams, milligrams, and that kind of thing at that time when I was baking and cooking. Now it has become pretty much second nature to me, but I had adapted it. So this is done in the American measurement system, and it appears in two different places on my website, on the blog. One, probably about 2 years ago, the summer of 2018, I spent some time on the island of Washington Island in Wisconsin at a beautiful lavender farm called Fragrant Isle Lavender Farm. And I blogged about making scones and scones with lavender at that time. So if you scooted back through the blog, you could find the recipe. And I believe it's the full recipe for the English tea scones. Yesterday, April 4, I will date this video a little bit. Yesterday, I also posted the recipe in preparation for doing this video today. And I did post it as a half recipe because most people are going to be likely to make maybe a dozen scones, and that would be fabulous for their family at the time. I'm used to cooking for a large group, so it was no problem for me to make 24 scones. You probably don't need that many at once. So we're going to start with a smaller recipe. But let me tell you what you're going to need. You are going to need some flour, and today I'm going to be working with a gluten-free flour, but I will show you the difference between working with a regular traditional flour, wheat flour, and working with gluten-free. You will need a little bit of sugar. These are not terribly sweet scones, but you can sweeten them by adding things like chocolate chips or dried fruit, that kind of thing to it. We are going to need some salt, some baking powder. Because we are doing gluten-free, we are also going to be adding a little bit of baking soda. And that will react with the buttermilk that we're going to be using, and that buttermilk and baking soda reaction will give a little bit of rise to the scones, so they're not quite so much like hockey pucks, and actually they are quite delicious. So and have a good texture to them. So this recipe works pretty well. So we said flour, sugar, salt, baking powder, a little bit of baking soda. We also have an egg in this recipe. We have butter, about a 1/4 cup of butter, or like a half of a stick of butter, and some buttermilk. And then whatever dried fruit or chocolate chips you want to add or not add to the recipe will be added as well. Today I'm going to be using some raisins that have been soaking for just a little while in some whiskey vanilla. And it's vanilla made with whiskey. I make my own vanilla. And we are also going to be adding... No, I think we're just doing whiskey vanilla raisins today. I do have some other scones here that do have some chocolate chips in them, and I'll show you those in a minute. So those are the ingredients. I'm going to talk you through the process. You don't need anything really specific for making this, mix master. You don't even need some of the equipment that I have. You could even use your fingers for some of it. So it's a very simple recipe, and follow along. I think you'll find it easy to do. So here we go. I'm going to actually move the camera so you can see what I'm doing a little better. Okay, here we go, down and where I'm working. Okay, so first of all, let me show you the difference in the scones. So these lighter colored scones, and they're lighter because I didn't let them cook quite as long, bake quite as long, are made gluten-free. You can see they're not tremendously tall. but they have a very nice crumb to them. They break, they're soft-ish. They do break apart, and they're not really, really stiff, but they do work well with a cup of tea. They're fabulous. You can pop a little jam on them. You can cut them open. They are a little bit more crumbly just because that is the characteristic of the gluten-free flour. Then I have scones made with traditional flour, and you can see how much higher they have gotten. They're taller. And the crumb is a little bit more like bread or like a biscuit. And you can see as I'm pulling that apart, it's a little bit more like a biscuit. It's a little bit softer. Okay. This one has chocolate chips and currants in it. And I believe the gluten-free one is chocolate chips and raisins. Okay. So let me set those aside now. And we'll get started making our gluten-free scones today. So when you're working with gluten-free flour, I actually like to work with a 1-to-1 mix. I purchase a 1-to-1 baking flour. There are several brands out there. I've worked with several of them, and they're all pretty good. There are a few quirks, few tweaks you need to make to use it 1-for-1 in this recipe, but it works pretty well. So I'm going to start with the flour, 2 cups of flour. Put that in here. All right. Then I'm going to add to that, we're going to do all the dry ingredients first. I'm going to add to that the sugar. I've got just 2 tablespoons of sugar. We really don't need very much sugar in this recipe. It's not meant to be super sweet. And then we're going to add 1 tablespoon of baking powder. Put that in. A 1/2 teaspoon of salt. Probably is even a little bit less than that because I do not like to put full amount of salt in. I sometimes think things taste a little too salty. I do tend to use salted butter because that's what's in my refrigerator, and then I don't need quite as much salt in the recipe. And then I'm going to put in a 1/4 teaspoon of baking soda, and that is going to react with the buttermilk that I'm going to put in. And we're going to take and just stir that up a little bit, mix that together to get the dry ingredients kind of all mixed up. Okay, now, move these out of the way. Okay, now I'm going to add butter to this. So this recipe is becoming more like a pastry recipe. And so we'll put the butter in. This is chilled butter. I did cut it, if you can see, into kind of, I've got a light issue here with that window, kind of small pieces. So I've got those in smaller pieces. And we'll add those. And then I'm going to cut that butter in like you would with other pastry. Now this tool is actually an antique. It's a pastry cutter. It's wires. And it has a handle. This is an old handle. This I think is from the 1930s. And the way you use it, if you get your hands on one, or if you want to go to an antique shop someday when you can get out again, and find one of these. They are very handy for cutting butter into dried ingredients and mixing it up well because it works very quickly. There is another way, several other ways you can actually do this. If you do not have a pastry cutter, you can use knives. And let me show you how you would use them. So take 2 knives, and you're going to be using this motion, but you're actually, can you hear that? You're going to be rubbing the knives against each other as you do that and bringing them against the side of the bowl. By rubbing them against each other, you're cleaning them off, cleaning the extra butter that might stick to the knives off, and you're cutting through the butter against the side of the bowl. So basically it's like this, and you're cutting. This takes a little bit longer, a little bit more patience than you need with that pastry cutter, but it does the job. And what you're looking for is for the little nubbins of butter to become about pea-sized so that everything is pretty evenly distributed and cut into small pieces. The butter's cut into small pieces in this bowl. So basically this is how you do it. Another way to do it, if you don't want to do that, and you really want to have a little meditative time, make sure your hands are clean. Of course, they should be clean before you start anyway. And that is to just basically rub the butter into the dried ingredients, into the flour and salt. And by doing this, yes, you're warming the butter a little bit with your hands, not keeping it quite as chilled, but you're also incorporating it a little better as well. And you can feel those lumps and just kind of rub You just rub them between your fingers and incorporate the butter and the flour this way. I am, for the sake of, this is actually quite relaxing, by the way, but for the sake of this video and to get done a little bit faster so you can go on and make your own inspired scones, I am going to continue with my handy dandy pastry cutter and get finished with this. So what I do is basically cut. I'm beating down through to the bottom of the bowl and cutting, if you will, all of that. Whoop. Well, look at that. Isn't this fun? Okay, let's try this again. Isn't that fun? Okay, here we go. Things happen. All right, this is kind of down home, you know, so things happen. So I'm cutting this in. If I notice there's butter collecting on the wires, I'll just brush them off, wipe them off with the knife, and keep going. Now again, you'll want to do this until all of the butter or the little clumps look to be about pea size or tiny bean size in the bowl, and then you're ready to move on with the next step. You would be doing this whether the flour is regular, traditional wheat flour, or bread flour, or if you are going to be using gluten-free. And I have used bread flour, and actually these scones that were made earlier that are so tall are made with bread flour, which gives a little bit lighter texture to the bread of it, if you will. But you can use all-purpose flour. If you use whole wheat, I would not use 100% whole wheat, because you will not get as good a rise, and they will be more like hockey pucks. But you can actually add a little bit of white flour to that and to the whole wheat, and they'll be wonderful whole wheat scones. So that's pretty well mixed together. The next step is to add an egg, one egg, and I have an egg here, straight from the farms, almost straight from the chicken, and we're going to crack that into another dish. And the reason I do that is, especially when you're working with farm fresh eggs, not often, I shouldn't say that, but once in a great while, you will get an egg that just doesn't look quite right. And so rather than putting it right into your dough and then perhaps having to scrap the whole batch, put it in another bowl first, make sure the egg is fine, and then add it. Oh, I probably should have beat that egg. Well, I can beat it in here. Why not? Okay, then I have buttermilk here. The recipe calls for about a half a cup of buttermilk. I have learned that we need to go just a little bit more than that, because especially with the gluten-free flour, it doesn't all get incorporated. It needs a little bit more moisture to it to make it work. And so I have put about 3/4 of a cup of buttermilk in this pitcher. I may not need it all, but we'll start with about a half a cup and see where we go from there. Now, another substitution, if you don't have buttermilk, you can use regular milk, and you can put a teaspoon or two of lemon juice in that. Let it sit for a little bit. That acid of the lemon juice will combine with the basic property of the baking soda, and that will, like you do baking soda and vinegar, you will get that chemical reaction that will create the carbon dioxide and make your bakery rise a little bit. If you don't have lemon or lime or orange, some kind of citrus acid to add to that milk to curdle it a little bit, then you can also use just a little bit of vinegar, maybe about a teaspoon of white vinegar. But because that kind of will give a little bit of a vinegary taste, I tend to say that that's my final choice, my last choice for doing that. So let's put about a half a cup of liquid in to our bowl and start stirring. I just use a fork to stir, and that allows me to kind of see how things are going in here without heavy-duty mixer action, and to start incorporating the liquid with the dry ingredients. Now you can see this is kind of dry. There's some fluffy areas along the edges that hasn't gotten wet yet. So I'm going to add a little bit more buttermilk to this, kind of in the driest areas. Put it right on. And we'll mix again. Continue mixing. We don't want it to be too wet. It shouldn't be sloppy like a cake dough, but it should be not super dry. And since I'm going to be adding a little bit of whiskey vanilla to this as well, I can back off a little bit on the buttermilk that I put in. I still have some areas where it's kind of dry in here, so I am going to add that whiskey vanilla that is in here. Actually, I don't want to put all the raisins in yet. Some may fall out, but let's put some of that vanilla in there. A little bit more moisture. And see where we're at with that. I think I'm going to still use. So I had about 3/4 of a cup of buttermilk, but you know, it's going to depend on what kind of flour you're using and how your bowl looks as to how much you actually put in. Again, you don't want it to be super sticky, but you don't want it to be really dry and crumbly. Terribly crumbly. Okay, this looks good. It's starting to stick together to itself. I could make like a dough ball with this, so we are done at this point with that. As I'm pulling it off the fork, it should slide right off. It should be sticky, but not like goopy. So we're good. Aren't those great technical terms? I love it. All right, so now what we're going to do is we're going to add, we need to knead this just a little bit, just to kind of get it into a smooth ball. So I'm going to add the raisins to that. And they are a little bit damp too. Now these are dried raisins. If you're using dried fruit that has not been soaked, this was soaked only a little bit, but has not been soaked, you are going to want to make sure you have a little bit more of the milk, or use a little juice, or in this case I used the whiskey vanilla to add to it, because as the raisins, as the scones bake, the raisins are going to absorb some of that moisture as well, and you will end up with a drier product at the end if you don't have enough moisture. But again, I don't have a lot of extra flour in my hands, just a little bit. And so we don't want it to be super sticky. I'm kneading it right in the bowl, maybe 6 or 7 times. I think the recipe says 4 or 5 times. But what you want to do is you want to get everything incorporated from the bowl into this ball, and the ball should not be super sticky. You should be able to handle it pretty well. Okay, so I'm gonna get these in here. Now we're good. I'm gonna get rid of this. Now here comes a really fun trick. How do you knead this? How do you work this out? Well, I could take this ball of dough and set it right on the parchment that I have here. And by the way, if you don't have parchment, just grease your pan. I could set it right on here, pat it down to about 1 inch thick or so, and take a knife or a bench scraper and just cut it into wedges, just and leave it all together, but cut into wedges. They will rise a little bit. It will become like one piece, almost like a loaf of bread, but they tear apart into wedges. You could do that. I am going to choose to actually cut these with a cutter. Now, I don't need a special breadboard underneath. I don't need any special kind of paper underneath. I am just using this kitchen towel. It's a smooth weave towel. It doesn't have a lot of waffles in it or anything like that. But a little bit of flour on that, and I can just pick this up right off of the towel. I'm going to pat this. You don't even need a rolling pin. Pat this to about 1 inch thick, maybe a little bit thicker, but approximately 1 inch thick. And then I'm going to take a cup. Now this one, as you can see, it is tapered. That doesn't matter a whole lot. We're only going to be, putting dough into about here, and we can flatten that a little bit. You might have a glass that you want to use. You might have a cookie cutter you want to use. The idea is to cut this like a cookie cutter, like you would with a cookie cutter, and cut it into smaller pieces. I'm using a plate of flour and just dipping the edges of the cup into the flour, and that will help this to not stick as I cut. Press down like you would with a cookie cutter, and there is my first scone, and I'm going to set that right over here on the pan, on the parchment. Of course, the thicker you cut them, the fewer you will get out of it, but this recipe will make 10 to 12 scones. And you'll want to make sure that they're all pretty much the same thickness. There we go. If your cup gets too goopy, just kind of pull the dough off, set it in the flour again, and keep going. Some of these little raisins on the edge, when they bake, will get really hard. So I don't want a lot of them sticking off the edge. they'll just kind of burn. And so we'll just put them right back in the dough. Almost done. This really doesn't take very long to do. It's kind of easy. You can use some of the ingredients you already have in your home. So now, of course, when we are all stuck in home, having to be at home because of the public health crisis we have in the country right now, actually around the world, it's nice to be able to make do with what you have at home and still come up with something really nice to serve during the week or for a special occasion. These actually are wonderful as brunch scones, or even to have with just a cup of tea in the afternoon and to enjoy. Or you could do as I did this last week, have a virtual coffee meeting with your friends, and you can be nibbling on your scones and they'll be nibbling on their treats and drinking coffee and that kind of thing, or a cup of tea while you visit, which is really a nice thing to be able to do. Still stay connected with people who you love to be with. Okay, just a couple more I can get out of here. I just keep picking up the scraps, and I'm just going to put a little bit more flour on here. And you don't want to work with it too much. It'll make the dough kind of stiff and tough. So you want to, the least little bit that you can work with it. Got one last one out of here. And then the last one I'm just going to form into a ball. It's a little scone. This could be the Cook's Choice scone as a taster. And I'll bring this over so you can see it. I have all of the scones now. These will not spread. They will rise a little bit. And they are going to bake now. What do I have here? 6, 11, including this little one. So that's pretty good. If I had made them slightly thinner, I would get 12. So this is ready to go. I have set the oven already for 420 degrees. They will bake. The gluten-free scones should bake around 15 to 18 minutes. They take a little bit longer than the traditional scones. So these baked, I'll show you these. They were kind of dark. If you look at the bottoms got pretty dark. That's because I set it for 18 minutes and then forgot to check them at 15. So my husband assures me he does not mind. Mr. Century Farmhouse does not mind crispy scones, so he gets to have these, or most of them. And these baked for, I think, 18 to 19 minutes, and they're much lighter. These are the gluten-free ones. So they're much lighter on the bottom, although you still have a nicely browned bottom. So what I suggest you do is this. If you don't really know how your oven works, put them in your oven for 15 minutes. Then check them. If they look like they're kind of turning brownish, golden, the bottoms look pretty golden, but they probably aren't quite done yet, take a piece of foil. Let me grab one. Take a piece of foil and just lay it on top of them in the oven. Put them back in for another 2 to 3 minutes. The foil will reflect some of that heat, will keep these from getting too brown, but they'll continue to bake. Okay, and then you can take them out, put them on a cooling rack for a few minutes, 5 to 10 minutes, and you'll have a nice warm scone that you can enjoy with a cup of tea or a cup of coffee. So I'm going to pop these in the oven. Set my timer for 15 minutes. That's set. And I'm going to put this camera back up if I can get this to work. There we go. So that's it. That's how easy it is to make these English tea scones. I hope you do try it. I hope you play with the recipe and have a lot of fun with it and enjoy eating the scones as well, and you and your family can enjoy them. So thank you so much for enjoying this. Thank you so much for joining me here, and I hope we can do this again sometime. Bye.